The diplomatic vessel Starlight Crown hung in the darkness of space like a jewel against black velvet, and Princess Salith Calvora stood at the observation window with her arms crossed and her golden eyes narrowed in frustration. She had received the news an hour ago, and she still could not believe the insult her father had allowed. A human guard, the Volanti Empire, had conquered 37 worlds across 6 centuries, and their warriors were legendary throughout the known galaxy. But now she was expected to accept protection from one of the soft creatures that had only discovered faster-than-light travel 100 years ago. Her chief advisor, Torvain, stood behind her with his silver scales gleaming under the soft lights of her chamber. "Your Highness, the Alliance Treaty requires this exchange," he said in his careful diplomatic tone. Earth's government was quite insistent that their personnel be included in royal security details. "Then let them guard cargo ships," Salith replied without turning from the window. "I am the third daughter of Emperor Calvora the Mighty, and I will not be protected by prey species." Torvain said nothing because he knew better than to argue when she used that tone. The door chimed, and Salith finally turned around as her handmaiden, Valises, entered with a human male walking 3 steps behind her. Salith studied him and felt her frustration turned to something close to amusement. He was average height for a human, perhaps a bit taller, with brown hair cut short and eyes the color of Earth's oceans. And he wore the simple gray uniform of Earth's Diplomatic Protection Service without any medals or decorations. He carried no visible weapons. He showed no aggressive posture. He simply stood there with his hands clasped behind his back and waited. "This is Jake Harris," Valises announced with barely hidden contempt in her voice. "He has been assigned to your security detail as per the treaty requirements." Jake Harris inclined his head in a gesture of respect but did not bow as Volanti protocol demanded. Salith walked toward him slowly and circled him the way a predator might circle wounded prey. He did not flinch or react, simply followed her with his eyes and kept his expression neutral. "You are smaller than I expected," she said. "Earth's ambassador promised me their finest protection specialist, but they have sent me someone who looks like he has never seen combat. I have seen enough." Jake replied in a quiet voice. His tone held no challenge and no defensiveness. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered without emotion. Salith stopped in front of him and tilted her head. The Volanti were tall and elegant, with iridescent scales that shifted color with their moods. And she stood nearly a head taller than this human even without her ceremonial heels. "Where are your weapons?" she demanded. "I carry a sidearm when regulations require it," Jake answered. "Otherwise, I prefer to remain unarmed." "Unarmed?" Salith repeated the word like it tasted foul. "My Volanti guards carry plasma rifles and vibroblades, and you wish to protect me with nothing but your soft human hands." "Yes." The single word hung in the air between them. Salith glanced at Torvain, who looked equally unimpressed, and then she made her decision. "Very well," she said with a cold smile. "You may join my security detail, but you will not stand beside my warriors because you have not earned that honor." She pointed to the door. "You will stand outside my chambers when I sleep, and you will carry my luggage when I travel, and you will fetch refreshments when I require them," she continued. "Perhaps in time you will prove yourself worthy of actual duties, but I doubt that day will come." Jake nodded once. "As you wish, Your Highness." He showed no anger at her words. He showed no wounded pride or resentment. He simply accepted her orders and waited for dismissal. This bothered Salith more than she wanted to admit. Her Volanti guards would have bristled at such treatment, and even the most disciplined warriors from other species would have shown some reaction to such obvious disrespect. But this human acted like her insults meant nothing at all. She waved her hand in dismissal, and Jake turned and left the chamber without another word. "What do you think?" she asked Torvain after the door closed. "I think the humans have sent us their weakest," her advisor replied. Perhaps they believe any warm body will satisfy the treaty requirements. Or perhaps they simply have no one better to offer. Salith nodded in agreement. Over the following days, she tested her theory by assigning Jake Harris the most humiliating tasks she could imagine. She made him wait outside her door for 12 hours while she attended a banquet inside. She ordered him to carry her personal luggage through the station while her Volante guards walked ahead unburdened. She sent him to fetch exotic drinks from the far side of the station, simply because she wanted to see if he would complain. He never complained. He completed every task without protest and returned to his post with the same neutral expression he always wore. Her handmaidens began to mock him openly. They called him the princess's pet and laughed about his smooth pink skin and his lack of natural weapons. Volante guards ignored him entirely because he was beneath their notice. Jake said nothing to any of them. He simply watched and listened and stayed close enough to respond if needed. One evening, Salith observed him from her balcony as he stood at his post below. A group of Karth traders passed by, and one of them deliberately shouldered into Jake hard enough to knock a lesser being off balance. Jake absorbed the impact without moving and simply turned his head to watch the Karth continue down the corridor. He did not chase after them. He did not shout threats or demand apologies. He just returned his attention to his duty and continued watching the approaches to her chambers. He is either the most cowardly creature in the galaxy, Salith murmured to herself, or he simply does not care about anything at all. Neither option impressed her. She retired to her chambers that night, convinced that the humans had indeed sent their weakest. The Alliance would survive this insult, but she would make certain Earth's government understood their mistake. She would request a proper warrior to replace this silent, unimpressive human. And perhaps then the treaty would actually mean something. She fell asleep without giving Jake Harris another thought outside her door. He stood in perfect stillness and watched the shadows with eyes that missed nothing, had heard every word of mockery and endured every humiliation without reaction because none of it mattered. He was not here to earn respect or prove his worth. He was here to protect the princess, whether she wanted his protection or not. The galaxy would learn that truth soon enough. The transport ship descended through the thick green clouds of Karth Prime, and Princess Salith felt the familiar excitement of the hunt building in her chest. This jungle world had belonged to the Volante Empire for 300 years, and every generation of nobility came here to prove their courage against the deadly creatures that stalked beneath the endless canopy. She wore her ceremonial hunting armor of polished silver and carried a plasma lance that had belonged to her grandmother. Behind her stood 12 Volante warriors in full combat gear, and somewhere at the back of the group, Jake Harris walked in his simple gray uniform with no weapon and no armor. The transport landed in a clearing that had been burned into the jungle specifically for royal visits, and the heat hit them immediately as the ramp lowered. Karth Prime was a steam bath of humidity and danger, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the sounds of unseen predators calling to each other in the shadows. "Today, we hunt the Shadow Fang," Salith announced to her gathered nobles and warriors. "The greatest predator on this world and the most prized trophy in the Empire." The nobles cheered and raised their weapons. The Shadow Fang was legendary among the Volante 6. Legs and 3 meters of muscle and venom, with black scales that absorbed light and eyes that glowed amber in the darkness. Only the bravest hunters pursued them, and many never returned. Zelith had killed one before when she was barely an adult, and today she intended to add another trophy to her collection. The hunting party moved into the jungle in a standard formation with scouts ahead and warriors flanking the nobles. Jake Harris walked at the rear where Salith had assigned him. Far from any position of importance, she glanced back at him once and noticed that he moved through the undergrowth with surprising silence for someone wearing standard boots on unfamiliar terrain. Perhaps He was not completely useless after all. The first hour passed without incident as they followed a trail marked by the shadow fangs. Distinctive claw marks on the massive tree. Silith noticed something strange. During the second hour, the jungle had gone quiet around them. The constant background noise of creatures calling and moving through the brush had faded to nothing, and even the insects seemed to have fled. Her chief scout, Varn, returned from ahead with confusion written across his scaled face. "Your Highness, the wildlife is behaving strangely," he reported. "Predators that should be stalking us are moving away from our position. Perhaps they sense the size of our hunting party," Salith suggested. "No, it is something else," Varn replied. "I have hunted this world for 40 years, and I have never seen behavior like this." He paused and glanced toward the back of the group where Jake Harris stood waiting patiently. "It seems to be centered around the human." Salith frowned and looked at Jake, who showed no reaction to being discussed. "That is ridiculous," she said. "What could these predators possibly fear from one unarmed human?" She dismissed the observation as coincidence and ordered the party to continue. They tracked the shadow fang to its den as the sun began to set behind the endless canopy. The den was a cave carved into a hillside by ancient water, and the entrance was marked with bones of previous prey arranged in patterns that suggested terrible intelligence. Say felt her heart's beating faster as she raised her plasma lance. "Surround the entrance," she ordered. "Drive the creature out, and I will take the killing shot." Her warriors moved into position with practiced efficiency. They activated their sonic emitters and began sending pulses of sound into the cave designed to irritate the shadow fang and force it from its shelter. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the darkness inside the cave shifted, and two amber eyes appeared. The shadow fang emerged like a nightmare. Given physical form, it was larger than any Salith had seen before, easily 4 meters from snout to tail, and its black scales seemed to drink the fading light. It moved with fluid grace on 6 legs that ended in claws, dripping with paralyzing venom. The creature surveyed the hunting party, and Salith saw something in those amber eyes that made her blood run cold. It was not afraid. It was calculating. The shadow fang attacked without warning. It moved faster than anything that size should be able to move, and crashed into the warrior line before anyone could fire. Claws tore through Volanti armor like paper, and 2 warriors fell screaming before the creature wheeled around for another pass. Plasma bolt scorched its scales but did not penetrate the shadow fang. Grabbed a 3rd warrior and threw him into the undergrowth. And then it turned towards Salith with hunger in its glowing eyes. She raised her lance but knew she would not be fast enough. The creature was too close and moving too quickly. This was how she would die, torn apart by a predator on a world her ancestors had conquered centuries ago. Then Jake Harris stepped between them. He did not run or shout or draw a weapon. He did not have. He simply walked forward and placed himself directly in the shadow fang's path. The creature lunged toward him and then stopped. Salith watched in disbelief as the massive predator froze mid-stride. With its claws extended and its jaws open, Jake stood perfectly still and stared directly into those amber eyes. The shadow fang made a sound Salith had never heard from any creature on this world. It was a whine of pure animal terror. The predator backed away slowly, its 6 legs trembling and its tail tucked against its body like a frightened Petty kept its eyes fixed on Jake as it retreated step by step toward the darkness of its den. It did not attack. Again, it did not try to circle around him or find another target. It simply fled into the shadows and disappeared. The jungle was silent. Salith stood frozen with her plasma lance still raised and her mind unable to process What she had just witnessed, the greatest predator on Korth Prime. A creature that had killed 3 Volanthi warriors in full armor, had run away from an unarmed human. Jake turned around and walked back to his position at the rear of the group, as if nothing unusual had happened. "We should return to the transport," he said in his quiet voice. "The wounded need medical attention." Salith wanted to demand answers. She wanted to grab this strange human and force him to explain what she had just seen. But the groans of her injured warriors reminded her of her duty, and she ordered the retreat instead. The hunting party made their way back to the clearing. In silence, no one spoke. About what had happened, no one knew what to say. Salith looked at Jake Harris as they boarded the transport, and he met her gaze without expression. In that moment, she realized she had made a terrible mistake. This human was not weak. He was something else entirely, and she intended to discover exactly what that something was. The starlight crown cut through the void between stars as it carried Princess Selith back to Volanthi Prime. But she barely noticed the journey because her mind was consumed by questions she could not answer. She had not slept properly since Korth Prime. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Shadow Fang backing away from Jake Harris with terror in its ancient predator gaze. She needed to understand. Her private study aboard the vessel was filled with data screens and communication arrays, connected to every intelligence network in the Empire. She had spent 3 days digging through classified files and reaching out to contacts across the known galaxy. The official record on Jake Harris was frustratingly ordinary. Born 28 years ago in a place called Montana on Earth's western continent, enlisted in Earth's military at 18, transferred to the Diplomatic Protection Service after 6 years of services. Fitness reports described him as competent and professional. Nothing more, but Salith knew that official records often hid more than they revealed, and she had not survived the dangerous politics of the Volanthi court by accepting surface explanations. She contacted Merchant Lord Gavros, who traded regularly with human colonies and owed her family several significant favors. His holographic image flickered to life above her desk with his 4 arms spread in greeting. "Your Highness," he said with a bow of his elongated head. "How may I serve the Empire today?" "Tell me about humans," Salith commanded. "Tell me what the official records do not include." Gavros hesitated, and his multiple eyes blinked in a pattern that suggested nervousness. "The humans are good trading partners," he said carefully. "They honor their contracts, and they pay fair prices for goods." "That is not what I asked." Gavros sighed and lowered his voice, even though their communication was encrypted. "There are stories," he admitted. "Warnings that traders pass to each other when dealing with humans. But I always assumed they were exaggerations." "What kind of warnings?" "Never threaten a human's family or their ship crew," Gavros said. "Never corner them or make them feel trapped. And never assume that because they are smiling, they are not dangerous." He paused, and his eyes flickered with old memories. "I saw a human dock worker kill a Crossian slaver with his bare hands once. And the Crossian was twice his size and fully armed," Gavros continued. "The human did not even seem angry. But when the Crossian grabbed a child from the loading bay, the human simply walked up to him and broke his neck like it was nothing." Salith leaned forward. "What else?" "They call Earth a death world," Gavros said. "Extreme temperatures and massive storms and predators that make our worst nightmares look friendly. And the humans did not just survive there for hundreds of thousands of years. They thrived. Every species survives their homeworld." Salith pointed out. "Not like humans," Gavros replied with a shake of his head. "Most species evolved to fit a specific environment, but humans adapted to all of them. And they did it by becoming the most persistent hunters their world has ever known." The connection ended and Salith sat in silence for a long moment before accessing the Imperial archive. She searched for first contact reports and scientific studies conducted when humanity entered the galactic community. Most of it was dry academic language that told her nothing useful. But then she found a research paper written by a xenobiologist named Dr. Velisis Karine, who had studied human biology for the Volanti Science Council. The paper was marked classified and restricted to senior imperial official. Salith overrode the restriction with her royal credentials and began to read. The first pages cover basic human anatomy, which was unremarkable by galactic standards. 2 arms and 2 legs and forward-facing eyes, typical of predator species. Endurance-based cardiovascular system capable of sustained activity for hours without rest. Tolerance for pain and temperature extremes. But then Salith reached the section on human biochemistry, and her blood ran. Cold humans produced a complex cocktail of chemical compounds in their sweat and breath, and these compounds triggered instinctive fear responses in predator species across dozens of worlds that had never had contact with Earth. The xenobiologists theorized that this was not coincidence, but rather evidence of convergent evolution. Predators throughout the galaxy had independently developed the ability to recognize certain chemical signatures as warnings. Stay away from this creature. It is not prey. It is something worse. Humans carried that warning in their very biology without even knowing it. The Archaran had conducted experiments with various predator species and found that even creatures who had never encountered humans before would retreat from human scent markers. The scientist called it the apex signature and warned that underestimating humans based on their apparent physical weakness was a potentially fatal mistake. Silith set down the datapad and stared at the wall of her study. She thought about Jake Harris standing before the Shadow Fang. Without flinching, she thought about the predator backing away with terror in its eyes. The creature had not fled because of weapons or armor or technology. It had fled because every cell in its ancient brain screamed that the human standing before it was a threat beyond its ability to comprehend. Silith pulled up Jake's service record again and read between the lines of bureaucratic language. 6 years of military service with 3 combat deployments, transfer to diplomatic protection after an incident that remained classified. Even to her security clearance, multiple commendations for performance under pressure. She had dismissed him as a recruit because he was quiet and obedient. She had mocked him for showing no aggression, but now she understood that his silence was not weakness. It was control. A predator that needed to prove its danger was not truly dangerous at all. The real threats were the ones who had nothing to prove because they already knew exactly what they were capable of. Jake Harris had stood before her. Insults and humiliations without reaction because her opinion did not matter to him. Was not there to impress her or earn her respect. He was there to protect her. And nothing she said or did would change his commitment to that duty. Silith rose from her chair and walked to the window overlooking the stars. Somewhere out there was Earth, a world that had forged humanity through millions of years of relentless natural selection. The humans had not sent their weakest to guard her. They had sent someone perfectly suited to the task, a quiet professional who would not cause incidents but would end threats with brutal efficiency if necessary. She had treated him like a servant, and he had accepted it without complaint because servants were invisible and invisible guards could watch without being watched. Silith smiled despite herself. The humans were cleverer than she had given them credit for. She turned from the window and made a decision. It was time to speak with Jake Harris again, and this time she would listen. The orbital palace above Volanti Prime was the crown jewel of the Empire, a massive station of crystal spires and golden domes that caught the light of the nearby sun and scattered it in rainbow patterns across the void. Princess Salith stood in the grand reception hall surrounded by representatives from 12 different species, and the weight of diplomatic responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like physical armor. This summit had been planned for months. The topic was trade routes through contested space. and every faction present had something to gain or lose depending on the outcome. Asalith represented her father's interests with the authority to negotiate on behalf of the entire Valanthi Empire. She wore her formal robes of deep purple silk embroidered with silver thread, and the ceremonial crown upon her head marked her as a daughter of the imperial bloodline. Jake Harris stood 15 meters away near the eastern wall. He wore the same simple gray uniform he always wore, and most of the dignitaries had dismissed him as a minor functionary without bothering to learn his. Namasalith found herself glancing at him throughout the evening. She had not spoken to him privately since her research, and she still was not sure what she wanted to say. The Karth delegation arrived late, as was their custom, and Salith felt her scales tighten with old hatred when she saw their ambassador enter the hall. The Karth were a reptilian species who had warred with the Valanthi for centuries before a fragile peace was established 3 generations ago. They blamed her great-grandfather for the destruction of their colony world during the final campaign, and certain factions among them still dreamed of vengeance against her bloodline. Ambassador Thesk approached her with false warmth in his red eyes and offered the traditional greeting of his people. Selith returned it with equal insincerity, and they exchanged meaningless pleasantries while their aides watched for any sign of genuine emotion. The banquet began an hour later in the grand dining hall, where tables had been arranged to accommodate the various dietary requirements of a dozen. Specialith took her place at the head table and noticed that Jake had repositioned himself near the service entrance where he could see most of the room without being obvious about it. She wondered when he had learned to read Valanthi architecture well enough to identify the best tactical positions. The food was excellent, and the wine flowed freely as old enemies pretended to be friends for the sake of commerce. Lith listened to a boring speech by a merchant guild representative and let her mind wander to more interesting thoughts. She did not notice the 3 Karth servants moving through the room until one of them was already too close. The attack happened without warning. The first servant drew a blade from beneath his robes and lunged towards Salith with murder in his eyes. Her Valanthi guards reacted immediately, but they were too far away, and the assassin was too fast. Salith tried to rise from her chair, but her formal robes tangled around her legs, and she fell backward. Instead, the blade descended toward her throat. Then, a gray blur intercepted the assassin, and the blade never reached her. Jake Harris moved with a speed that should have been impossible for any creature his size. He caught the assassin's wrist and twisted it at an angle that produced a wet snapping sound, and the blade clattered to the floor as the Karth screamed in sudden agony. The second assassin came from the left with a plasma pistol that should have been detected by security, but somehow was not. Jake released the first attacker and spun toward the new threat. He closed the distance in 3 steps and drove his palm into the assassin's elbow. The joint bent the wrong direction, and the pistol fell from nerveless fingers. The third assassin was smarter than his companions. He did not rush forward with a weapon, but instead produced a small device and pressed the trigger. A sonic pulse filled the room, and everyone within 20 meters collapsed with blood streaming from their ears. Everyone except Jake Harris. He staggered slightly but kept moving. Assassin's red eyes widened in disbelief as the human crossed the remaining distance between them. Jake did not strike with fists or feet. He simply grabbed the Karth's throat and squeezed until the reptilian's eyes rolled back and his body went limp. 11 seconds. The entire attack had lasted 11 seconds from the first blade to the last unconscious body. Jake stood in the center of the chaos and breathed steadily while dignitaries screamed and guards finally arrived with weapons drawn. His gray uniform was splattered with Karth blood, but he showed no signs of injury, showed no signs of emotion at all. He simply scanned the room for additional threats, and when he found none, he turned to look at Salith. "Are you injured?" "Your Highness." His voice was calm, and his question was professional. He Might have been asking about the weather. For all the emotion he displayed, Zelith stared at him and could not find words. The representatives from the other species stared as well. The merchant lords backed away from Jake with fear in their multiple eyes. The Zari delegation pressed themselves against the far wall. Even the surviving Volanti guards kept their distance from the human who had just dismantled 3 trained assassins. With his bare hands, someone in the crowd whispered a word that Salith had heard in her research, but never expected to hear spoken aloud in polite company. Deathworlder. Jake ignored them all and walked toward Salith with his hand extended to help. Her rise, she took it and felt the warmth of his skin and the strength in his grip. He was not even breathing hard. The sonic pulse. She managed to say, "It should have ruptured your eardrums." "It did," Jake replied without concern. "My right ear is bleeding, but I can still hear from the left. And the pain is manageable." Manageable. He had continued fighting through an injury that had incapacitated every other being in the room, because he considered it manageably. Salith thought about her research and the warnings that traitors whispered about humans. Never corner them, never make them desperate, never assume their smiles mean they are not dangerous. She realized now that the warnings did not go far enough. Humans were not just dangerous when cornered, they were dangerous all the time. They simply chose not to show it because civilization required them to wear masks over their predator instincts. Jake Harris had worn that mask perfectly for weeks while she mocked him and humiliated him and treated him like a servant, but the moment she was threatened, the mask had come off, and the galaxy had seen what lay beneath. The other dignitaries would remember this night. They would tell stories about the human who moved like death itself and felt no pain and showed no mercy. They would warn their people never to threaten anything a human had chosen to protect, and Salith would never look at her quiet, unassuming guard the same way again. "Thank you," she said softly, and she meant it more than any words she had ever spoken. Jake simply nodded. "That is my job, Your Highness." 1 week had passed since the assassination attempt, and Princess Salith stood before the window of her private chambers aboard the Starlight Crown, watching the stars drift slowly past. The diplomatic summit had ended in chaos, but from that chaos had come unexpected benefits. The Korath government had officially disavowed the assassins and executed Ambassador Thesk for treason when evidence proved he had organized the attack. The other species had signed the trade agreement without further negotiation, because no one wanted to remain at the station any longer than necessary, and every representative had left with stories about the human who had saved the Volanti princess with nothing but his bare hands and an iron will. Zelith had received messages from noble houses across the empire asking about Jake Harris. They wanted to know where they could acquire human guards of their own. They wanted to understand what humanity truly was beneath their unremarkable appearance. She had not answered any of them yet because she had questions of her own that needed answers. First the door chimed, and she called for entry without turning from the window. Jake Harris stepped into her chambers and stood at attention near the entrance. He had recovered fully from the sonic pulse attack and showed no signs of the injury that had ruptured his eardrum. The Volanti medical staff had been amazed by his healing speed. They said humans could recover from wounds that would permanently disable most specialists. Turned to face him and gestured to a chair near her reading alcove. "Sit with me, please." Jake hesitated for a moment because this was not how their interactions usually proceeded. She had given him orders, and he had followed them. She had never asked him to sit and converse as an equal, but he crossed the room and took the offered seat while Salith settled into her own chair across from him. "I owe you an apology," she began. "I treated you poorly when you arrived, and I mocked you for traits I mistook as weakness. No apology is necessary. Your Highness, it is necessary, Salith insisted. I called you a recruit and assigned you humiliating duties and allowed my handmaidens to disrespect you openly. But you never once complained or demanded better treatment. She paused and studied his face for any sign of resentment. There was none. Why? She asked. Why did you accept such treatment when you could have requested reassignment or filed complaints through diplomatic channels? Jake was quiet for a moment as he considered his answer. Because your opinion of me did not change my duty, he said finally. I was assigned to protect you. And whether you respected me or despised me made no difference to that mission. But surely it bothered you. Pride is expensive. Jake replied with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. I cannot afford to let it interfere with my works. Silith leaned forward with genuine curiosity burning in her golden eyes. Tell me about Earth, she said. I have read reports and studied files, but I wanted to hear it from someone who lived there. Jake's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time, since she had known him, she saw something vulnerable beneath his professional exterior. Earth is beautiful, he said in a softer voice. Montana, where I grew up, has mountains that touch the sky and forests that stretch for hundreds of kilometers. And in the summer, the rivers run cold and clear from the snowmelt. And the dangers? The predators and disasters I read about. They exist, Jake acknowledged. But we learned to live with them long ago. And most humans go their entire lives without facing anything truly threatening. He paused and met her eyes directly. We do not think of ourselves as apex predators. Your Highness, and most of us would be uncomfortable with that label. He continued. We see ourselves as survivors who figured out how to work together against a world that was trying to kill us. But the way you fought, Salith pressed. The speed and the brutality and the complete absence of fear. That was not merely survival. No, Jake admitted. That was training. And instincts we usually keep buried because civilization requires us to be gentle with each other. Usually, when someone we are protecting is threatened, the gentleness stops. Salith absorbed this and thought about what it meant. Humans were not mindless killers or unstoppable warriors. They were people who had evolved in a harsh environment and learned to channel their dangerous instincts into protection rather than destruction. They chose to be civilized. They chose to wear masks of politeness and cooperation, but underneath those masks, they remained exactly what they had always been, the most successful persistence hunters their brutal world had ever produced. I want you to stay, Salith said suddenly. Not because the treaty requires it, but because I want you as my permanent guard. Jake's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. Your Highness, there are Volanthi warriors who would consider that position a great honor. I do not want Volanthi warriors, Salith replied firmly. I want someone who will protect me regardless of politics or pride. Someone who will not be distracted by court games or personal ambition. She smiled slightly. I want someone who considers a ruptured eardrum manageable and keeps fighting anyway. Jake was silent. For a long moment, I would need to contact Earth's government to request a permanent assignment change. I will speak with their ambassador personally, Salith said. I suspect they will not refuse a formal request from the imperial family. She stood and Jake rose with her out of respect. The galaxy is beginning to understand what humanity truly is. Salith continued. The stories from the summit are spreading, and soon every species will know that humans are not the soft prey creatures they assumed. Is that a good thing? I believe so, Salith answered. Fear can prevent conflicts that might otherwise end in bloodshed. And respect between species is built on understanding each other's strength. She extended her hand in the human gesture of agreement. She had researched specifically for this moment. Welcome to my permanent service. Jake Harris. He looked at her hand and then at her face. and she saw something shift in his ocean-colored eyes. It was not quite warmth, but it was close. He took her hand and shook it firmly. "Thank you." "Your Highness." "Salith," she corrected. "When we are in private, you may use my name." Jake nodded once. "Thank you, Salith." Later that evening, a delegation of Korath diplomats arrived at the station to formalize the peace agreement that had resulted from Ambassador Thesk's disgrace. They walked through the corridors of the Starlight Crown with their red eyes darting nervously at every shadow. When they passed the entrance to the princess's chambers, they saw Jake Harris standing at his usual post. He did not move or speak or make any threatening gesture. Simply watched them with those calm predator eyes. And every single Korath crossed to the far side of the corridor without being told. Salith observed this from her doorway and allowed herself a small smile. The galaxy was indeed beginning to understand humans had arrived on the interstellar stage just 1 century ago, and already they were changing how other species thought about strength and danger. They were not conquerors or empire builders. They were something far more valuable. They were protectors who chose their loyalties carefully and defended them without mercy, and now one of them had chosen to protect her. Salith returned to her chambers with a lightness in her step that she had not felt in years. For the first time since childhood, she felt truly safe outside her door. Jake Harris stood in perfect stillness and watched the corridors with eyes that missed nothing. He had a new home now, and he intended to keep it safe. The stars beyond the observation windows burned cold and distant. But aboard the Starlight Crown, the future of 2 species had been bound together by loyalty and blood. The alliance between humanity and the Volanti Empire would grow stronger in the years to come. And it had all begun with a princess who learned never to underestimate a quiet human. The galaxy would remember this lesson, and those who forgot it would learn again at their own cost.